In the frozen wasteland of Antarctica, something extraordinary happened in 1947. Something that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about the end of World War II. Operation Highjump wasn't just another military exercise. It was the largest, most heavily armed naval task force ever sent to the bottom of the world. 13 ships, almost 5,000 men, destroyers, aircraft carriers, submarines, all loaded with enough firepower to level a city. The official story was scientific research and cold weather training. But that was a lie. The real mission was far more dangerous, far more classified, and far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Leading this massive armada was Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated naval officers in American history. Medal of Honor recipient, the youngest Rear Admiral in Navy history, a man who had flown over both poles and lived to tell about it. But what he encountered in Antarctica would silence him forever. Because Operation Highjump wasn't hunting for penguins or studying ice formations. They were hunting for something else entirely. Something that had been hiding in the frozen darkness since the final days of the Third Reich. The story begins 3 years earlier, in the dying moments of Nazi Germany. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin, something was happening in the shadows. Equipment was being moved, personnel were disappearing, and massive resources were being diverted to a place no one would think to look. A place where the cold could hide secrets for decades, where the ice could bury evidence of the most advanced technology the world had ever seen. Technology that shouldn't have existed. Technology that defied everything science thought possible. December 1938. The German research vessel Schwabenland departed Hamburg on what appeared to be a routine Antarctic expedition. But aboard this ship were not just scientists and engineers. They carried members of the Thule Society, a secretive occult group that believed in the existence of a master race living deep beneath the Earth's surface. Their mission was classified at the highest levels of the Nazi command structure. Find a location for a secret base. Map the unexplored territories and make contact with whatever they might find down there. What they discovered would change everything. After weeks of aerial reconnaissance, they found it. An Arctic oasis, roughly 300 square miles of ice-free territory, warmed by geothermal vents beneath the ocean floor. Warm water, plant life, and most importantly, the perfect hiding place for what would become the most secret military installation in human history. Base 2111, a facility that would grow over the next 7 years into something resembling an underground city. A place where the Reich's most advanced weapons programs could continue their work, hidden from the world above. But Base 211 wasn't just a hiding place, it was a launching pad. As the war turned against the Axis powers, massive shipments of equipment and personnel began flowing south. U-boats that never returned to German ports. Scientists who vanished from their laboratories, and most disturbing of all, entire weapons programs that simply disappeared from the official record. Including the work of SS Oberfuhrer Hans Kamler, the man in charge of Hitler's most secret projects. Projects that involved aircraft unlike anything the world had ever seen. Disc-shaped craft that could hover, accelerate to impossible speeds, and maneuver in ways that violated every law of physics. Kamler himself vanished in April 1945 along with his personal aircraft, a long-range transport plane with a 4,000-mile range, enough to reach Antarctica from anywhere in Europe. And just months later, something extraordinary began happening across South America. Thousands of UFO sightings, disc-shaped objects performing impossible maneuvers in the skies above Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. Objects that bore an unsettling resemblance to the experimental aircraft that had been developed in Nazi laboratories. The American government couldn't ignore what was happening. Intelligence reports were flooding in from across the southern hemisphere. Something was down there, something that posed a direct threat to American security, and there was only one way to find out what it was. They would have to go to Antarctica, they would have to find Base 211, and they would have to destroy whatever they found there. This is where Admiral Richard Byrd enters the story. If the United States was going to send a military expedition to the most hostile environment on Earth, they needed someone who could get the job done. Byrd wasn't just qualified, he was the only man for the job. He had reached the rank of Rear Admiral by age 41, the youngest in Navy history. He was a recipient of the Medal of Honor, the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Silver Life-Saving Medal. In total, he had received 22 citations and commendations, including 9 for bravery and 2 for extraordinary heroism. He was, quite simply, one of the most highly decorated officers in the history of the United States Navy. More importantly, Byrd had experience in polar regions. He had led multiple expeditions to both the Arctic and Antarctic. He had flown over the North Pole in 1926 and the South Pole in 1929. He understood the challenges of operating in extreme cold, the logistics of moving men and equipment across ice, and the unique dangers that existed at the bottom of the world. If anyone could find and destroy a secret Nazi base in Antarctica, it was Admiral Richard Byrd. Operation Highjump commenced in August 1946. The official cover story was scientific research and military training in cold weather conditions. But the reality was far different. This was an invasion force. 13 ships, including the USS Mount Olympus, the USS Pine Island, 2 destroyers, 2 icebreakers, a tanker, multiple supply ships, and most significantly, the USS Philippine Sea, a state-of-the-art aircraft carrier loaded with fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. The task force also included the USS Sonnet, an attack submarine, and several heavily armed seaplanes. Nearly 5,000 men were involved in the operation. Marines, sailors, aviators, and specialists in cold weather warfare. They carried enough ammunition, fuel, and supplies for an 8-month campaign. The firepower at their disposal was staggering. Anti-aircraft guns, depth charges, torpedoes, bombs, and the most advanced radar and sonar systems available. This wasn't a scientific expedition. This was a military operation designed to locate and destroy whatever was hiding in the Antarctic ice. The task force arrived at Antarctica on January 15, 1947. They immediately began establishing a base camp called Little America, using prefabricated buildings and equipment specifically designed for Arctic conditions. From this base, they would launch reconnaissance flights across the continent, mapping unexplored territories and searching for signs of Nazi activity. The plan was methodical and comprehensive. They would search every ice shelf, every mountain range, every valley until they found what they were looking for. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. The mission that was supposed to last 6 to 8 months was suddenly terminated after just 40 days. The base was evacuated, the ships were recalled, and the entire task force retreated to Chile. When they arrived at port, rumors began to spread. Rumors of strange encounters, of aircraft that performed impossible maneuvers, of attacks by unknown forces, and Admiral Byrd, the man who had led the mission, made statements that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Admiral Byrd's mission was far from over. While the public heard sanitized reports about scientific research and military training, the truth was far more disturbing. The task force had arrived in Antarctica with enough firepower to level a small country, and they would need every bit of it. The first signs of trouble appeared just 2 days after establishing their base camp. Sailors on watch reported strange lights on the horizon, unlike anything they'd seen before. These weren't the familiar glow of aurora or distant ships. These lights moved with purpose, ascending at impossible angles before vanishing into the polar sky. Lieutenant John Sayerson, stationed aboard the USS Brownson, watched in disbelief as objects shot vertically from the ocean at tremendous speeds. The radar operators tried desperately to track them, but these craft moved faster than anything in the American arsenal. When anti-aircraft guns opened fire, the shells seemed to pass right through their targets without effect. The encounters escalated quickly. What started as mysterious lights became direct confrontations. According to declassified Soviet intelligence reports released after the Cold War, the American fleet found itself under attack by disc-shaped aircraft that emerged from beneath the ice. These weren't conventional planes. They made no sound, left no exhaust trails, and demonstrated flight capabilities that defied known physics. The USS Maddox, a destroyer that had survived the Pacific War, burst into flames after being struck by some form of energy beam. Sailors described a weapon that cut through steel like butter, leaving edges so clean they appeared to have been melted rather than torn. The torpedo boat began to sink, taking with it men who had fought across the Pacific only to meet their end in the frozen waters of Antarctica. But the most disturbing reports came from the air crews. Pilots launched from the task force's aircraft carrier found themselves facing opponents unlike anything they'd encountered during the war. These craft could accelerate from a standstill to supersonic speeds in seconds, make 90-degree turns without losing velocity, and hover motionless in the sky before shooting away at impossible angles. Captain Robert Hillenkoetter, who would later become the first director of the CIA, was among the observers who witnessed these encounters. His classified reports, partially declassified decades later, described aircraft that seemed to operate on principles beyond current scientific understanding. The craft showed no visible means of propulsion, no wings or control surfaces, yet they maneuvered with precision that made the Navy's best pilots look like amateurs. The technology wasn't just advanced, it was revolutionary. These aircraft seemed to manipulate gravity itself, hovering effortlessly above the ice before accelerating to speeds that should have torn them apart. When American fighters attempted to intercept them, the mysterious craft would simply vanish, reappearing miles away in the blink of an eye. Admiral Byrd himself had a close encounter that would haunt him for the rest of his life. During a reconnaissance flight over the interior, his instruments began malfunctioning. Both compasses spun wildly, his radio crackled with static, and the aircraft's controls became sluggish. As he struggled to maintain control, disc-shaped objects appeared on both sides of his plane. The craft were close enough that Byrd could see markings on their hulls, What he saw made his blood run cold. These weren't alien vessels from another world. The symbols were unmistakably terrestrial, unmistakably human, and unmistakably Nazi. The swastikas were clearly visible, painted on craft that shouldn't have existed. In that moment, the true scope of Operation Highjump became clear. The Nazis hadn't simply built a base in Antarctica. They had created something far more dangerous, using technology that seemed decades ahead of anything the Allies possessed. They had developed aircraft that could dominate the skies above any battlefield on Earth. The implications were staggering. If the Germans had achieved such technological breakthroughs, how had they lost the war? The answer was becoming increasingly clear. They hadn't lost. They had retreated, regrouped, and continued their research in the one place on Earth where no one would look for them. Base 211 wasn't just a hiding place, it was a fortress protected by weapons that made conventional military forces obsolete. The warm water oasis discovered during the 1938 expedition had been transformed into something resembling a scene from science fiction. Underground hangars housed fleets of disc-shaped aircraft, while laboratories pushed the boundaries of physics itself. The technology appeared to be based on principles that mainstream science dismissed as impossible. Anti-gravity propulsion, energy weapons that could slice through steel, and power sources that seemed to violate the laws of thermodynamics. Yet here they were, deployed against the most powerful naval force in history. Hans Kamler, the SS general who had overseen Hitler's secret weapons program, had vanished in the final days of the war along with his prototype aircraft. Intelligence reports suggested he had made his way to South America, but now it seemed more likely that he had gone much further south. The flying wing aircraft under his command could easily have made the journey to Antarctica, carrying with them the scientists and equipment needed to continue their research. The battles above Antarctica lasted for weeks, though the American public would never learn the full extent of the engagement. Ship after ship reported encounters with unknown aircraft. Pilots described dogfights against opponents who seemed to toy with them, demonstrating capabilities that made resistance futile. The breaking point came when the mysterious craft began targeting the task force's supply lines. Without warning, transport ships found themselves under attack by weapons that could disable engines and navigation systems without destroying the vessels entirely. It was as if their opponents wanted to send a message rather than inflict maximum casualties. The message was clear: leave or face consequences that would make the current encounters look like gentle warnings. Admiral Byrd, despite his legendary courage and determination, found himself facing an enemy that possessed overwhelming technological superiority. The mission that was supposed to last 6 to 8 months was abruptly terminated after just 40 days. The retreat was swift and decisive. The entire task force, representing the peak of American naval power, fled Antarctica like a defeated army. The official reports would blame weather conditions and equipment failures, but the truth was far more unsettling. The United States Navy, fresh from victory in the greatest war in human history, had been driven from the field by an enemy they couldn't match. As the ship steamed toward Chile, Admiral Byrd faced the most difficult decision of his career. The American people deserved to know what their military had encountered, but the truth would cause panic on a scale that could destabilize the entire nation. How do you tell the world that Nazi Germany had developed technology that could render every military force on Earth obsolete? The answer, as it turned out, was that you don't. The moment the task force reached port, a veil of secrecy descended over Operation Highjump that would last for decades. But in those first few days before the full weight of government censorship could be applied, Admiral Byrd made a few statements that would fuel speculation for generations to come. In an interview with the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, the admiral spoke of hostile forces that could attack any nation at any time, using aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He warned that the United States needed to prepare for a new kind of warfare, one that would make conventional military thinking obsolete. These weren't the words of a man who had conducted routine training exercises in harsh weather. These were the warnings of a military leader who had seen the future of warfare and found it terrifying. The technology that had emerged from the ice of Antarctica represented a quantum leap in military capability, one that could shift the balance of power on a global scale. The implications extended far beyond military considerations. If the Nazis had achieved such technological breakthroughs, what else might they have discovered in their underground laboratories? The stories of ancient artifacts and lost civilizations that had driven Hitler's occultist expeditions suddenly seemed less like fantasy and more like hidden history. The Thule Society's search for the entrance to a hollow Earth had led them to Antarctica, where they claimed to have found evidence of an advanced civilization. Whether that civilization still existed, or whether the Germans had simply reverse-engineered artifacts left behind by an ancient race. The result was the same. Technology that seemed impossible had become reality. As the task force sailed north toward the civilized world, the men who had witnessed these encounters were sworn to secrecy. The penalties for speaking about what they had seen were severe, and the message was clear. The events in Antarctica were to be forgotten, buried beneath layers of classification and official denial. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially secrets as momentous as these. In the years that followed, strange aircraft would be spotted around the world, displaying flight characteristics that matched the craft encountered during Operation Highjump. The modern UFO phenomenon was about to begin, and its origins might lie not in outer space, but in the frozen wastes of Antarctica. But what they discovered down there was far more chilling than abandoned concrete bunkers and rusted machinery. According to first-hand accounts from naval personnel who served during Operation Highjump, the Americans weren't just hunting ghosts in the ice. They were confronting something that shouldn't have existed. Something that defied every law of physics and military strategy they understood. The encounters began subtly. Strange radar signatures that appeared and vanished without explanation. Instruments malfunctioning in ways that seasoned technicians had never witnessed. Then came the sightings. Disc-shaped objects moving at impossible speeds, emerging from beneath the ice with no visible means of propulsion. These weren't weather balloons or atmospheric anomalies. They were craft unlike anything in the American arsenal. What made these encounters truly terrifying wasn't just the advanced technology on display. It was the markings. Multiple witnesses reported seeing familiar symbols on these mysterious aircraft. Nazi insignia, swastikas emblazoned on machines that moved through the Antarctic sky, with capabilities that seemed decades beyond anything the Third Reich had demonstrated during the war. The implications were staggering. If the Nazis had indeed established a functioning base in Antarctica, complete with aircraft that could outmaneuver the finest American fighters, then the war hadn't truly ended. It had simply moved to a battlefield where the United States held no advantage whatsoever. Admiral Byrd's forces found themselves facing technology that operated on principles they couldn't comprehend. These craft didn't just fly faster than conventional aircraft. They seemed to ignore the basic laws of aerodynamics entirely. They could hover motionless in hurricane force winds, accelerate from 0 to thousands of miles per hour in seconds, and perform maneuvers that would have pulverized any human pilot. The first direct engagement occurred when American fighters attempted to intercept one of these mysterious craft. The results were devastating. The unknown aircraft didn't just evade the American planes. It demonstrated capabilities that bordered on the supernatural energy weapons that could disable electronics from miles away. Propulsion systems that left no heat signature, no exhaust trail, no evidence of conventional thrust. Within hours, it became clear that Operation Highjump had stumbled into something far beyond a simple Nazi holdout. This wasn't a desperate group of war criminals hiding in the ice. This was a fully operational military installation with technology that made the most advanced American weapons look like museum pieces. The naval task force that had arrived in Antarctica with such confidence suddenly found itself outmatched and vulnerable. Ships that had dominated the Pacific theater during World War II were now sitting ducks against craft that could appear and disappear at will. The hunters had become the hunted. What followed was a series of encounters that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. American aircraft were systematically disabled or destroyed by weapons that seemed to operate on entirely different principles than anything in the conventional military arsenal. Ships reported being overflown by craft that moved in perfect silence, their crews paralyzed by the realization that they were facing something utterly alien to their understanding of warfare. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical losses. These were men who had fought across the Pacific, who had seen the worst that human warfare could produce. But nothing had prepared them for this. The craft they encountered moved with an intelligence and capability that suggested their pilots weren't just using advanced technology. They were using technology that seemed to bend the fundamental laws of physics. Reports filtered back to Admiral Byrd's command describing encounters that defied rational explanation. Craft that could phase in and out of visibility. Weapons that could neutralize entire squadrons without leaving a trace of conventional damage. Most disturbing of all, intercepts of radio communications in German, suggesting that whatever force controlled these craft, it was indeed connected to the Nazi regime. The reality of Operation Highjump was becoming clear. The United States military had sailed to Antarctica expecting to mop up the remnants of a defeated enemy. Instead, they had discovered that the enemy had evolved far beyond anything they were prepared to face. The technology on display wasn't just advanced, it was revolutionary. It represented a quantum leap in military capability that rendered conventional warfare obsolete. As the encounters intensified, Admiral Byrd faced an impossible decision. His forces were clearly outmatched. The craft they were facing possessed capabilities that made resistance not just futile, but potentially catastrophic. The technology gap wasn't measured in years or decades. It was measured in paradigms. The Americans were fighting with conventional weapons against forces that seemed to operate outside the known laws of physics entirely. The final engagement that sealed Operation Highjump's fate occurred when a coordinated attack by multiple American squadrons met with devastating results. The mysterious craft didn't just defend themselves. They demonstrated the ability to project power across vast distances to neutralize threats before they could even engage, and to coordinate their actions with a precision that suggested either perfect communication or a level of artificial intelligence that was decades ahead of anything the Americans possessed. In the aftermath of these encounters, Admiral Byrd made the decision that would define the rest of his career. Rather than continue a hopeless campaign against superior forces, he ordered a full withdrawal. Operation Highjump, the most ambitious military expedition in Antarctic history, was terminated after just 40 days. The official reason given was weather conditions, but the truth was far more disturbing. The United States military had encountered something in Antarctica that challenged every assumption about the balance of global power. The Nazi experiments with advanced propulsion and energy weapons hadn't just succeeded. They had produced technology that was generations ahead of anything the Allies possessed. The implications for global security were staggering. The story doesn't end with Admiral Byrd's retreat. If anything, that's where the real mystery begins. Because what happened next proves that Operation Highjump wasn't just another classified mission. It became the foundation for decades of secrets, lies, and cover-ups that continue to this day. Within weeks of returning to the United States, Admiral Byrd found himself in a position he'd never experienced before. Complete silence. The man who had conquered both poles, the celebrated hero of American exploration, was suddenly forbidden from speaking about his greatest mission. The debriefing at the Pentagon lasted for days, not hours, days. And when it was over, every sailor, every pilot, every officer who had witnessed what happened in those frozen waters was bound by oaths of secrecy that would follow them to their graves. But silence breeds rumors, and the rumors that emerged from Operation Highjump were unlike anything the military had ever tried to contain. Stories began circulating through intelligence networks across the globe. The Soviets were particularly interested. Their own intelligence reports, declassified decades later, described American forces fleeing Antarctica after encounters with technology that defied explanation. Flying craft that moved without sound, weapons that disabled entire ships with beams of energy, and aerial maneuvers that no earthly aircraft could perform. The Nazi connection wasn't just speculation, it was based on hard evidence that the military couldn't explain away. The disc-shaped craft bore markings, familiar markings, and their behavior suggested not random encounters but coordinated defense of something valuable, something worth protecting. The pilots who survived those encounters described aircraft that seemed to anticipate their movements, technology that rendered their weapons useless, and a level of organization that spoke of military discipline rather than random phenomena. What makes this even more compelling is what happened to the survivors. Those who returned from Operation Highjump were scattered across different bases, different assignments, different continents. The official explanation was routine reassignment, but the pattern was clear. Anyone who had witnessed the encounters in Antarctic waters found themselves isolated, monitored, and eventually silenced. Some retired early, others transferred to desk jobs. A few simply disappeared from military records altogether. The technological implications were staggering. If the Nazis had indeed established a base in Antarctica, and if they had continued developing their advanced aircraft programs, then the post-war world was facing a threat that nobody had anticipated. The flying saucers weren't just experimental aircraft. They were production models, operational weapon systems, and they were being deployed from a location that was virtually inaccessible to conventional military forces. This explains why the Antarctic Treaty was signed just 18 months after Operation Highjump. 12 nations, including former enemies, suddenly agreed to make Antarctica off-limits to military activity. The official reason was scientific cooperation and environmental protection. But the timing tells a different story. The treaty wasn't about protecting Antarctica from humanity. It was about protecting humanity from whatever was in Antarctica. The treaty established something unprecedented in human history. An entire continent, larger than Europe, was declared neutral territory. But neutral to whom? And why did nations that couldn't agree on anything else suddenly find common ground when it came to keeping people away from the South Pole? The answer lies in what Admiral Byrd and his forces encountered during those 40 days in 1947. The craft they faced weren't just technologically superior, they were strategically positioned. The Antarctic location provided perfect cover, isolated, inhospitable, and protected by some of the worst weather conditions on Earth. Any military force attempting to establish a presence there would face logistical nightmares that would make the craft's job of defense almost effortless. And that's exactly what happened. But the story gets even stranger when you consider what happened to Nazi leadership at the end of the war. Hans Kamler, the SS general in charge of Hitler's secret weapons program, vanished without a trace. His body was never found. His whereabouts after April 1945 remain unknown, and his prototype aircraft, including the long-range Junkers 390, disappeared with him. The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. Kamler wasn't just another Nazi officer. He was the architect of the V-2 rocket program, the overseer of underground weapons factories, and the coordinator of projects that pushed the boundaries of 1940s technology. If anyone had the knowledge and resources to establish a secret base in Antarctica, it would have been him. And if anyone could have continued developing advanced aircraft in isolation, it would have been his team of engineers and scientists. The UFO sightings that began appearing across South America in late 1945 weren't random phenomena. They followed specific patterns. Flight paths that originated from the Southern Ocean, technology that matched descriptions of Nazi experimental aircraft, and timing that coincided perfectly with the period when Nazi personnel and equipment were being evacuated from Europe. What Admiral Byrd encountered in Antarctica wasn't just a remnant of the Third Reich. It was the continuation of it, a hidden civilization that had used the cover of the frozen continent to develop technology that made the rest of the world obsolete. And when the United States finally sent a force large enough to challenge them, they demonstrated that conventional military power was no match for their advanced systems. The retreat from Antarctica wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It was a recognition of reality. The United States had encountered a force that could destroy their entire task force without breaking a sweat. The disc-shaped craft didn't just outmaneuver American aircraft, they disabled them. The energy weapons didn't just damage ships, they rendered them helpless. And the message was clear. Stay away. That message has been respected ever since. Despite advances in military technology, despite the development of nuclear weapons, despite the exploration of space, Antarctica remains largely untouched. The areas that are accessible to researchers represent a tiny fraction of the continent. The rest remains as mysterious today as it was in 1947. So what's really down there? The evidence suggests a civilization that has had decades to develop without interference. Technology that began with Nazi experimental aircraft and has had 70 years to evolve, and a strategic position that makes them effectively untouchable by conventional forces. Operation Highjump wasn't just a military defeat, it was humanity's first encounter with a post-human civilization. The implications are staggering. If the reports are accurate, then everything we think we know about the modern world is incomplete. The Cold War, the space race, the development of advanced military technology, all of it happened in the shadow of a civilization that had already surpassed human capabilities. And that civilization has been watching, waiting, and occasionally reminding the world that they're still there. The UFO phenomena that began in 1947 and continues today isn't about visitors from other planets. It's about neighbors from the bottom of the world. Neighbors who have made it clear that they prefer to remain hidden, but who possess the technology to make themselves known whenever they choose. Admiral Byrd's warning about aerial attacks from the poles wasn't about a future possibility. It was about a present reality that the world wasn't ready to accept. Operation Highjump ended in retreat, but the story it began continues. Every unexplained aircraft, every impossible maneuver, every encounter with technology that defies explanation could be connected to what lies beneath the Antarctic ice. And until humanity is ready to confront that reality, the secrets of 1947 will remain buried in the frozen wasteland where they were discovered. The question isn't whether Operation Highjump encountered something extraordinary in Antarctica. The question is whether we're ready to admit what that something was, and what it means for the future of human civilization. Because if the reports are true, then we're not alone on this planet. We never have been. And the neighbors we've been ignoring for 70 years may not be content to remain hidden forever.